In the autumn of 1967, a demolition crew was sent into a forgotten hollow in West Virginia to tear down the last standing structure of an abandoned homestead. The county had condemned the land decades earlier. No records explained why. The crew worked through the morning without trouble. Old wood, old stone, nothing unusual. But when they pried up the floor of what had once been a kitchen, they found a cavity beneath it. A space that should not have existed, according to the original building plans filed with the county in 1889. Inside that space, they found something that made two grown men refuse to finish the job. What they found was never fully explained. The county sealed the report. The land was buried under a reservoir 3 years later, and the hollow has not been walked by a living person since. This is the story of the Pruitt family, the family that lived in that house. The family that neighbors said sang every night, but was never once seen at church, at market, or anywhere else. And this is the story of what was waiting under their kitchen floor. The hollow had no official name. On the oldest maps of Randolph County, the area was simply left blank, a pale, unmarked gap between two ridgelines, as if the surveyors themselves had decided it was not worth the ink. Locals called it Hollow Bend, for the way the only trail in curved sharply around a wall of granite before opening into a narrow valley. The valley caught almost no direct sunlight in winter. Fog settled into it most mornings and did not lift until well past noon. By 1880, only one family lived there, the Pruitts. They had come from somewhere east, nobody quite remembered where, and built a homestead at the lowest point of the hollow, beside a creek that ran cold even in August. The house was modest from the outside. 2 stories, a porch, a stone chimney that always seemed to be smoking, even in summer. The nearest town was 11 miles away, a half-day's walk along a trail that flooded easily and froze hard in winter. Few people made that walk more than once or twice a year. What made Hollow Bend strange was not its isolation. Plenty of families in those mountains lived isolated lives. What made it strange was the sound. Travelers who passed near the ridge at night, on the rare occasions anyone did, reported hearing singing. Not loud, not joyful, exactly. A low, layered sound, many voices overlapping, rising and falling in a rhythm that did not match any hymn the travelers recognized. One trapper, a man named Elias Vance, wrote in a letter to his brother in 1884 that the singing from Hollow Bend sounded like, quote, a church choir trying to remember a song they had only heard once, end quote. He said it did not frighten him. He said it made him feel like he was the one being watched, while something else listened to the music. The Pruitts themselves were rarely seen. The patriarch of the family, a man named Josiah Pruitt, occasionally appeared at the general store in town to trade furs and dried meat for salt, flour, and lamp oil. He was tall, quiet, and always paid in exact change, as though he had counted it out long before arriving. He never brought his children. He never mentioned his wife by name. When asked how many people lived at the homestead, his answers were never quite the same twice. Sometimes he said 5, sometimes 7. Once an old shopkeeper named Hiram Webb later told his grandson Josiah had paused so long before answering that Hiram thought he might not respond at all, and when he finally did, he said, quote, however many the house needs, end quote. Nobody pressed him further. In those mountains, in those years, a man's family was his own business, and strange answers were often just the way mountain folk spoke. Quiet, indirect, careful with words, the way some people are careful with money. But Hiram Webb remembered that conversation for the rest of his life. He told his grandson about it more than once, always ending with the same line. He said Josiah Pruitt's eyes, when he said however many the house needs, did not look like a man being evasive. They looked like a man stating a fact he wished were not true. According to the county census of 1880, taken by a traveling clerk who visited Hollow Bend only once, the Pruitt household consisted of 6 people. Josiah Pruitt, head of household, age 44, occupation listed simply as farmer. His wife, listed only as Mrs. Pruitt, age unspecified, the clerk having written that she declined to give her age or her given name. 4 children. 2 sons, Caleb and Noah, ages estimated at 16 and 13. 2 daughters, Ruth and a younger girl, whose name the clerk recorded only as May, age estimated at 6. The clerk's notes, preserved in the county archive, contain one strange detail that historians later found difficult to explain. In the margin beside the entry for May, the clerk had written a single word, crossed out so heavily it had torn through the paper. The word, as best as later researchers could make out beneath the ink, appeared to be 7th. No explanation was given. The clerk who filled out that census, a man named Thomas Aldridge, died the following year. His cause of death was recorded as a fall, though his body was found nearly half a mile from the nearest cliff or ledge that could have caused such an injury. Of the Pruitt children, only Ruth, the elder daughter, appears in any later records. In 1889, at the age of approximately 15, Ruth Pruitt was seen in town for the first and only time without her father. She had walked the 11 miles alone. She arrived at the general store just before closing, barefoot despite the cold, and asked the shopkeeper, Hiram Webb's father at the time, a single question. She asked him if he knew where the nearest church was, and whether a person could live inside one if they had nowhere else to go. The shopkeeper, taken aback, asked her if something was wrong at home. According to the account passed down through the Webb family, Ruth did not answer with words. She simply pulled back the sleeve of her dress, just slightly, just enough for him to see a mark on her forearm. He described it later only as a shape, burned or carved into the skin, that he did not recognize and did not want to look at for long. Before he could ask anything else, a wagon arrived outside, Josiah Pruitt's wagon. Ruth's expression changed immediately. The shopkeeper said it was as though a light had gone out behind her eyes. She left with her father without another word. The shopkeeper never saw her again. After Ruth's visit to town, Hiram Webb's father did something unusual. He mentioned the encounter to the local pastor, a man named Reverend Amos Kettering, who served the small wooden church in town and occasionally rode out to outlying homesteads to offer services to families too far to attend Sunday worship. Reverend Kettering had, in fact, attempted to visit the Pruitt homestead once before, in 1885. He had ridden out unannounced, intending to offer the family the sacraments and to formally welcome them into the congregation, as was customary for new arrivals in the county, even if their arrival had been years earlier. He never reached the house. According to his journal, which survives in fragments in the Historical Society's collection, Reverend Kettering described approaching Hollow Bend on horseback and hearing the singing for the first time himself. He wrote that the singing was, quote, beautiful in a way that troubled me more than any ugliness could, end quote. He wrote that as he got closer, his horse began to resist, planting its hooves and refusing to continue down the trail, no matter how he urged it. He dismounted and continued on foot. He wrote that he reached a point where he could see the house through the trees, smoke rising from the chimney, lamplight in the downstairs windows, the singing, louder now, coming from inside. And he wrote that he counted the windows and counted the silhouettes moving behind them, and the numbers did not match what he expected. He counted 6 silhouettes. The census had recorded 6 people. But Reverend Kettering wrote that the silhouettes did not move like 6 separate people moving independently. He wrote that they moved, quote, together, like reflections of each other, like the same shape repeated, end quote. He turned back without ever reaching the porch. He told no one in town what he had seen, only that he had been unable to make contact with the family due to, in his words, the lateness of the hour. It was only after Ruth's visit, 4 years later, that he finally wrote down what he had witnessed that day, in the journal entry that survives. The final line of that entry reads as follows: "I am ashamed to say I did not go back. I told myself it was prudence. I believe now it was something closer to instinct, the kind that keeps a man from putting his hand near a flame, even before he understands why the flame is dangerous." Reverend Kettering did not attempt to visit Hollow Bend again. 2 months after writing that entry, he resigned his post and left the county, citing health reasons. He died 11 years later in a different state, and according to family letters, he never spoke of West Virginia again for the rest of his life. The winter of 1890 brought the heaviest snowfall the county had seen in a generation. Roads were impassable for nearly 2 months. No one traveled to or from Hollow Bend, and no one expected to. When the thaw finally came in early spring, a trapper named Walter Briggs, the same trade route once used by Elias Vance years before, passed near the ridge above the hollow on his usual circuit. He noted something immediately. The smoke was gone. For as long as anyone could remember, the Pruitt chimney had smoked, year-round, day and night. It was, in fact, one of the only consistent signs that the family was still there at all, since they were so rarely seen. Briggs also noted something else. The singing was gone. He sat on the ridge for nearly an hour, he later said, simply listening to the silence, because the silence itself felt wrong. He described it as the kind of quiet that comes after a sound has been going on so long you forgot it was there, and then it stops, and the absence is louder than the sound ever was. Briggs did not go down into the hollow. He continued his circuit, and upon reaching the next settlement, mentioned what he had observed to a few people, mostly in passing, as an oddity rather than an alarm. It took nearly 3 weeks for anyone to act on it. The person who finally did was Hiram Webb's father, the shopkeeper, troubled by the memory of Ruth's visit the year before and by the mark he had seen on her arm. He organized a small group, 4 men in total, to travel out to Hollow Bend and check on the family. It was, he later said, simply the neighborly thing to do, though privately he admitted he had not been able to stop thinking about Ruth's question: whether a person could live inside a church if they had nowhere else to go. The 4 men set out on a clear morning in April of 1890. They reached the ridge above the hollow by early afternoon. What they found, according to the account recorded by Hiram Webb decades later from his father's retelling, was a house that looked, from the outside, completely undisturbed. The door was closed. The windows were intact. Smoke was not rising from the chimney, but the chimney itself appeared recently used, the stones around its base still faintly warm to the touch, despite the cold spring air. There was no answer when they knocked. After several minutes, the men opened the door themselves. The house was empty, not abandoned in the way a house looks when a family packs up and leaves. There were no missing belongings, no signs of a hurried departure. Plates were set on the table, 4 of them, as though a meal had been laid out and never eaten. A fire had burned down to ash in the hearth, but had clearly been burning recently. A child's shoe sat by the door, alone, with no matching pair anywhere in sight. The beds upstairs were made. Clothing hung neatly in a wardrobe. A Bible sat open on a small table beside the window, and according to Hiram Webb's account, the page it was open to had several passages underlined in a dark, reddish ink that one of the men initially mistook for blood, though closer examination suggested it was simply a poor quality dye that had degraded with age. There was no sign of Josiah Pruitt, his wife, or any of his 4 children. There was also, the men noted, no sign of struggle, no broken furniture, no blood, no indication of violence of any kind. It was as though 6 people had simply stood up from their meal, mid-bite, and walked out of their lives without taking a single step toward the door. The disappearance of the Pruitt family became, for a brief period, the most discussed event in the county. A formal search was organized, larger than the initial group of 4. Men combed the hollow and the surrounding ridgelines for nearly 2 weeks. They found no bodies, no graves, no signs of the family anywhere within a reasonable distance of the homestead. They did find a few things that did not make sense. The creek that ran beside the house, the same cold creek that had always run clear, was found to be running with a faint reddish tint near its source, roughly 200 yards upstream from the homestead. Samples taken at the time were inconclusive, attributed by the county doctor to mineral deposits in the soil, iron content from the surrounding rock. But several of the search party members noted that the color did not behave like mineral runoff. It did not spread evenly through the water. It moved in threads, almost like something dissolving slowly from a single point, rather than leaching steadily from the ground. No source for the discoloration was ever found. The search party also discovered something in the root cellar beneath the house, a space separate from the main structure, accessible only through a trapdoor in the pantry. Inside the cellar, they found preserved food, jars of vegetables and meat, stacked along the walls in neat rows, far more than a family of 6 could need for even several winters. They also found, carved into the wooden support beam at the center of the cellar, a series of marks. Not letters, not numbers, at least not any numbering system the men recognized. The marks were later sketched by one of the search party members, a man with some education, who described them in his notes as, quote, tally marks, but grouped strangely, as though counting something other than days, end quote. He counted the total number of marks. There were 147. He also noted that the marks appeared to continue past the point where the beam met the ceiling, as though whoever carved them had simply kept going onto the floorboards above, into the kitchen itself, and the marks on the floorboards had been recently sanded away, the wood there noticeably lighter and smoother than the surrounding boards. Someone had tried to remove the marks, recently, after the family disappeared. This detail troubled the search party more than anything else they found. It meant that someone, after the Pruitts vanished, had returned to the house, had gone down into that cellar or up into that kitchen, and had deliberately tried to erase part of what was written there. No one in the search party had done this. They were all accounted for, all together, the entire time. The marks on the beam itself were left untouched, perhaps because removing them would have required cutting into the support structure of the house itself. The search was eventually called off. The county officially classified the Pruitt family as missing, presumed dead, likely the victims of an accident, or, the report speculated without evidence, a possible attack by a wild animal, despite the complete absence of remains. The homestead was left standing, but no one in the county would agree to live there. Within a year, it was formally condemned, the land marked unsuitable for habitation, though the official reasoning given was vague, citing only, quote, structural and environmental concerns." End quote. For nearly 70 years, the house in Hollow Bend stood empty. It was not destroyed by fire, as so many abandoned homesteads eventually were. It was not looted, despite its remote location, despite the preserved food and furnishings left inside. Locals, even those willing to hunt and trap in the surrounding hills, avoided the hollow itself entirely. A few stories persisted, passed down through families like the Webbs, about why. The most consistent story concerned the singing. According to several accounts, collected informally over the decades by local historians and a few curious writers, the singing did not stop after the Pruitts disappeared. It changed. Where once the singing had been described as layered, many voices, rising and falling in a rhythm, travelers found unsettling, but not threatening. The singing that was occasionally reported after 1890 was different. It was described as a single voice, always at night, always coming from the direction of the house, though no one ever claimed to see anyone there. And it was always, according to every account, singing the same thing, counting, not words, not a hymn, a voice, low and steady, counting upward, slowly, with long pauses between each number, as though waiting for something between each count. One account, from a hunter in 1912, claimed he had gotten close enough to hear the count clearly, and that it had reached the number 146 before he turned and ran. He did not stay to hear what number came after that. The number 147, of course, was the number of tally marks found carved into the cellar beam in 1890. The same number the search party had documented in a report that was sealed in the county archive and not made publicly accessible until decades later. The hunter in 1912 had no way of knowing that number. He had never seen the report. By his own account, he had never even heard of the Pruitt family before that night. When he was later told what the report contained and what number it specified, he reportedly refused to discuss the matter again and moved out of the county within the year. There is a final piece of local lore connected to the house, one that is harder to verify than the others, passed down mostly through oral tradition rather than written record. It concerns Ruth Pruitt, the eldest daughter, the one who had walked 11 miles alone in 1889 to ask if a person could live inside a church. According to this account, in the spring of 1891, exactly 1 year after the family's disappearance, a girl matching Ruth's description appeared at the small wooden church in town late at night and was found the next morning asleep in one of the pews. She would not speak. She would not give her name. She bore the same mark on her forearm that the shopkeeper had described seeing in 1889, the shape he had refused to look at for long. She was taken in by a family in town, given a new name, and lived the rest of her life never once returning to Hollow Bend, never once speaking about her childhood, and never once explaining where she had been for the years since her family vanished. She died in 1944, an old woman by then, having never married, having lived a quiet and, by all accounts, ordinary life. But according to the family who took her in the final days before her death, she began speaking again about her childhood for the first time in over 50 years. She did not talk about her parents or her siblings or the disappearance. She talked about the kitchen floor. She said, according to the account passed down by that family, that the house had needed 7, and that there had only ever been 6 of them, and that every year, on a night she would not describe further, the house would choose. She said that in 1890, it had finally stopped choosing from them. She did not explain what that meant. She died 2 days later. In 1967, the state announced plans to construct a reservoir that would flood several hollows in the county, including Hollow Bend, to create a new water supply for a growing town downstream. Before flooding could begin, the state required all standing structures within the flood zone to be assessed and, where necessary, demolished to prevent debris and contamination once the water rose. A small survey team was sent into Hollow Bend that summer, the first official visit to the site in decades. Their job was simple: document the structure, assess for hazards, and clear it for demolition. The team consisted of 3 men, 2 surveyors, and a county records clerk sent to update the property file, which had not been touched since 1891. The clerk, a young man named Daniel Foss, later gave an account of that visit that was recorded by a local historian in the 1980s, as part of an informal oral history project documenting the area before it was lost to the reservoir. Foss described the house as, quote, untouched in a way that felt wrong, end quote. He said it did not look like a structure that had been empty for 77 years. The roof had not collapsed. The windows were intact. Even the furniture inside, when they entered, was in remarkably good condition, far better than the decades of exposure should have allowed. He said the plates were still on the table, 4 of them, exactly as the original search party had described in 1890. He said the child's shoe was still by the door. The 2 surveyors began their assessment of the structure, focused mainly on the roof and foundation, to determine the safest method of demolition. Foss, with little to do until they finished, began updating the property file, comparing the current condition of the house against the original 1890 report, which he had brought with him. It was Foss who noticed the discrepancy. The original 1890 report included a basic floor plan of the house, sketched by one of the search party members at the time. According to that floor plan, the kitchen had a single floor, directly above the foundation, with no additional space beneath it beyond the root cellar, which was accessed separately through the pantry. But standing in the kitchen in 1967, Foss noticed that the floor sounded different in one section, near the hearth, when he walked across it. Hollow, where the rest of the floor was solid. He mentioned it to the surveyors, mostly out of idle curiosity, expecting it to be nothing: a gap in the foundation, a settled support beam. One of the surveyors, a man with some construction experience, pried up a section of the floorboards near the hearth to check. Beneath the boards was a cavity, roughly 4 feet deep, the same footprint as the kitchen above it, lined with stone on all sides, like a second cellar that existed nowhere on the original floor plan, and that the 1890 search party had apparently never found, despite searching the cellar accessible through the pantry thoroughly. This space had no entrance from the pantry cellar. It had no stairs, no trapdoor, no visible means of access from anywhere else in the house. The only way in was through the floor itself, from directly above. And the floorboards that had been pried up, Foss noted, were the same floorboards that the 1890 report described as recently sanded, the section where the tally marks from the cellar beam below had appeared to continue before being deliberately removed. The marks had not been removed to erase them. They had been removed to seal something in. What the surveyors found inside that hidden space, according to Daniel Foss's account, was the reason the demolition was halted that day and never resumed by that crew. The space contained no bodies, in the sense that most people would expect. There were no skeletons, no remains that could be identified as human in any conventional way. What it contained was bones, a great many of them, but arranged. Foss described the arrangement as, quote, deliberate, the way a person arranges things they want to be found, not the way things end up by accident, end quote. The bones were arranged in a circular pattern, radiating outward from a central point, layer upon layer, going down as far as the surveyors could see without further excavation. Foss estimated, based on the density and depth of the layers visible from the opening alone, that the arrangement could represent hundreds of individuals. At the center of the pattern, at the point all the layers radiated outward from, was a single object that did not belong with the rest. It was small. Foss described it as roughly the size of a clenched fist, dark in color, and shaped in a way he struggled to describe. He said it was not quite organic and not quite mineral. He said looking directly at it for too long gave him a headache that lasted for the rest of the day, and that he found it difficult afterward to recall its exact shape, even though he had looked at it for several minutes. He said the two surveyors, both experienced men who had worked construction and demolition for decades, refused to go any closer to the opening once they saw what was inside. One of them, Foss said, simply turned around, walked out of the house, and sat in the truck for the rest of the day without speaking. The other surveyor took photographs. Those photographs were included in the report Foss filed with the county that week. The report and the photographs were sealed by the county the following month, classified under a designation typically reserved for sites of potential historical or archaeological significance, pending further review. That further review never happened. The reservoir project proceeded on schedule. The house in Hollow Bend was not demolished by that crew, but a second crew, sent 6 weeks later, completed the demolition without incident, according to the brief follow-up report on file. The follow-up report makes no mention of the hidden space beneath the kitchen floor. It describes the demolition as routine. When asked about this discrepancy decades later, during the oral history project, Daniel Foss had only one comment. He said that by the time the second crew arrived, the cavity beneath the kitchen had already been filled in. Concrete, poured roughly, clearly done in a hurry, clearly done by someone who had been there in the 6 weeks between the two demolition attempts. He said the county never told him who had ordered that work done or who had carried it out. He said he never asked. The reservoir was completed in 1970. Hollow Bend and everything within it now sits beneath roughly 60 feet of water. The sealed report from 1967 remained classified for over 40 years. It was finally made available in partial form in the early 2000s as part of a broader effort to digitize old county archives. By that point, most of the people directly involved had died. Daniel Foss passed away in 2003, just 2 years before the records were released. His account, preserved through the earlier oral history project, remains the most detailed first-hand description of what was found. The photographs taken that day were included in the digitized files, but according to several researchers who later attempted to view them, the images themselves were severely degraded, far more than the age of the film should account for. Most show only indistinct shapes, shadows, and what appears to be the edge of the opening in the floor. The central object Foss described is not clearly visible in any of the surviving images. One researcher who reviewed the file in 2011 as part of an unrelated study on historical demolition records noted one additional detail that had not previously been documented. Attached to the back of one of the photographs, in handwriting that did not match Foss's, nor either of the surveyors whose names appear on the report, was a single short note. The note read as follows: "It was not the family that disappeared. It was the seventh, finally taking its share." No further explanation accompanied the note. No name. No date beyond the original 1967 filing. The researcher photographed the note before the file was, according to later requests, unable to be located again in the archive. Subsequent attempts to retrieve the original file have returned only the redacted version, without the note attached. As for Ruth Pruitt, the woman who survived, who lived the remainder of her life under a different name, her grave can still be found in a small cemetery in the county, one of the few locations connected to this story that was not lost to the reservoir. Her headstone bears only her adopted name, the name given to her by the family who took her in, and the years of her birth and death. But for many years after her death, visitors to the cemetery reported one consistent detail about her grave that set it apart from the others nearby. The grass around it never grew evenly. Always, in a rough circular pattern around the stone, the grass grew thinner, paler, as though something beneath the soil was drawing away whatever it needed to thrive. The cemetery groundskeepers reseeded that section of grass multiple times over the decades. Each time, within a season, the same pattern returned. The cemetery was relocated in 1989 to make way for a road expansion. All graves were moved to a newer site several miles away. According to the relocation records, every grave was successfully transferred and accounted for. Every grave except one. The reservoir that now covers Hollow Bend is, by most accounts, an unremarkable body of water. Fishermen use it. Families picnic along its banks in the summer. Most people who live nearby have no idea what lies beneath the surface, or that a hollow ever existed there at all. But there is one detail that long-term residents of the area sometimes mention, almost in passing, usually when asked if anything strange ever happens around the lake. On certain still nights, particularly in late autumn, when the water is calm and the surrounding hills are quiet, some say you can hear something coming from beneath the surface. Not loud, not constant, a low sound, rising and falling, many voices overlapping in a rhythm that does not match anything modern. And underneath it, if you listen closely enough, a single voice, separate from the rest, counting. Some say it stopped, decades ago, somewhere around 146. Others say it never stopped at all. They say it is still counting now, and that whatever it is counting toward, it has not yet reached 147 again. Not yet. This is a work of fiction. All names, locations, events, and characters in this story are entirely invented for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.